Hello and welcome everyone to this event. My name is Claudine Blamey. I'm the Group Director of Sustainability at Aviva. And I've got some great panelists here with me. We are waiting for one other, but we'll get going and hopefully she'll join us when she comes in. So to my left is Tanya Steele. She is the CEO of WWF. And to my right, I've got Mardy McBrien, who is Chief Strategic Affairs and Capacity Building at ISSB. And when she joins us, we'll have Kate, who is Director of Sustainable Finance at E3G and Co-Head of Transition Plan Task Force. So today's event and our aims are to catalyse a meaningful conversation about how we integrate nature into climate disclosures. And what do we mean by disclosures? That is, we are talking about both risks, impacts, and dependencies. And of course, that forward-looking transition plan as well, which is why Kate will be here with us a bit later. So I think I will, just before I start asking questions, just highlight that we've been working with WWF, Aviva has been working with WWF for quite some time in a partnership. And as a part of our partnership, we've been looking at nature restoration, both in the UK and other markets that we operate in Canada and in Ireland, and have some real practical projects on the go and on the ground in terms of that resilience, that climate mitigation and adaptation that nature brings to that space. And we are working in the UK, for example, in restorations around flood risks and working in those communities to do that. And I just wanted to highlight that, how important that is and how important it is to have the right partner beside you to be able to deliver such projects as well. So let's dive in. And I will go to my first question. So we'll do see how we go. We'll do about half an hour or so of questions from me, and we'll have a bit of a panel discussion. And then I will throw open to the floor and see if there are any questions from you as well. So question one is about closing the gap between ambition and implementation. Last year, we had the agreement of the historic Global Biodiversity Framework, which saw some commitments on nature. But the global stocktake, we know, is the ambition that is not easy to implement on the ground. So to kick us off with this discussion, I want to start with a broad question to all our panelists. Given the sobering picture painted by the stocktake, how do we ensure that global commitments on aligning finance actually turn into tangible action? And what is the role of sustainability disclosure in this space? So, Tanya, can I turn to you first to answer that question?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much for having us and for everyone for joining us. I know the queues have been chaotic this morning. It's quite a feat to have actually made it here. A few things. I mean, Carbon Brief heading into this COP process reminded us that we're at 3.5 degrees before the stocktake, and the stocktake is still obviously very well underway. And that's based on current policies and current actions. So there is an awful, awful lot of work to do. And importantly, one critical thing that we can do as part of this stocktake is actually ensuring that nature is increasingly a part of this transition. We know we won't meet our climate change targets without putting nature very much at the heart of those decisions. There is no realistic scenario or pathway that does not assume that there will be more nature on this planet rather than less if we are to get anywhere close to limiting global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. So action really to both restore and protect our natural carbon sinks, apart from the other incredible benefits that nature provides. But even just through a climate lens, really protecting and restoring those carbon sinks is going to be essential. Not least, and I know you'll know this statistic, but it's worth putting it into the room, we know that more than 50% of all human man-made GHG emissions have been already absorbed by nature. So any potential reduction of that would be a huge issue. Now, importantly, sustainability disclosures really can enable the foundations, if you like, for us to actually start to take action. And I often use the pandemic as a very good example as to when many global businesses started to take a step back and they cracked open their supply chains and they realized how global they were and how fragile they were. And it was only through starting to work through some of those supply chains they realized some of their greater risks, including nature and the basis on which they needed to strengthen their plans moving forward. So disclosures inevitably really help firms to understand the sustainability challenges they face, but importantly, will start to point to some of the commitments and steps that they can take going forward. So if we are to ensure that we really not just raise the ambition, but actually start to act, we are going to need to accelerate some of the best practice, some of the standardization, and bring disclosure frameworks increasingly into regulation so that we do have a level playing field. There's real clarity. I know many businesses, many financial institutions do ask for that stable policy environment, and certainly moving beyond voluntary regulations is going to be really critical. So, of course, I, for one, welcomed the Task Force on Nature-related Disclosures. I'm sure we'll come to that later as well. But frameworks like that, alongside the work of the ISSB and indeed GFANZ, I think are really, really critical. So I think perhaps I'll stop there. I can go on endlessly, but I think there'll be opportunities to come forward with some more thoughts later too.
Great. Thanks very much, Tanya. Mardi.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us this morning. I mean, Tanya's done a very good job of just covering off all of that, but we do need a stable global baseline, and this really is a process now where we're talking about companies moving from those ambitious statements to concrete actions and allocating the right resources, both financial and people-based resources, needed for defining and implementing the key actions and setting concrete targets against that. And sustainability disclosures in the global baseline we hope to set at ISSB can guide companies by asking those right questions, the right information for it to be disclosed. So for example, in our climate standard, IFRS S2, which I'll talk about a bit more later, requires people to talk about the allocation of resources to meet these challenges. So it's a good prompt guide to what you should be thinking about and how you should be acting. So once applied, these sustainability disclosure standards can bring transparency on these aspects, so helping with that allocation of resources, but also hold companies to account.
Thanks, Mardi. Maybe I can ask a question related to that. So I know that ISSB is increasingly considering the climate and nature nexus as it relates to the information needs for the investors. So investors really do need that information to be able to understand how to deploy capital. And we're already kind of doing that. Aviva's already doing that. Down that journey, we've started looking at assessments in biodiversity, how our investments are impacted by them. So I think that everyone needs to do that. So what do you think, what's your view on the extent to which investors are looking for information on nature-related risks, impacts, and dependencies?
We absolutely know they are looking for it. And you just said it yourself. I know you're at the front of the pack at Aviva and doing a fabulous job and setting a very hard pace for everyone else. But we do know investors want this information. We listen to the market, the IFRS. We don't do anything without asking the market first. We're market-led, and we set standards for investors. So that's very much the framing with which we do everything. And with that, we really are trying to support investors with those trade-offs and those synergies between climate and nature through the standards. And we do know that climate mitigation opportunities, do come from nature restoration, for example. So as many of you know, and I talked about, and I'm going to link this back to the standards, we published our first two standards, the General Requirement Standard, S1, and the Climate-Related Standard, S2, in the end of June this year. And when I talk about those two standards, S1 is, when I say general requirements, it's the how to report on any sustainability issue. And I'm going to stress that, any sustainability issue. And S2 is the climate standard. So if you have a material effect from climate that is nature related, you need to report it using your climate standard. So just to be very clear, there is a good set of standards already there across a global baseline to support that. But we are supported, it's great to put standards out, right? That's all fine. But we're really supported in the implementation of the standards. Without that, it's very difficult to get that global baseline that we need for the capital markets to get the information they need. So as part of our commitment, we're working very hard on the development of educational material to support preparers applying our requirements. One of these particular materials, which I believe is imminent for release, focuses on the nature and social aspects of climate-related risks and disclosures. We also have additional industry-based guidance for implementing the climate standard, which includes examples of climate-related risks and opportunities and metrics that cover other nature topics, such as water and land issues. So that already exists as well to get you started now and can be used. And so when companies are considering and thinking about how they're reporting, we do also suggest that they do these, you do use the climate standards. So I'm being a bit clumsy here because I'm trying to think about how to communicate it in the clearest way. But we do say, if you are reporting on climate and land, or there is a land or water issue, that you do report it, because emissions are where the real trouble starts, right? You do need to be doing it, and that's what the standards are there. And we are working on this nexus piece. We've heard loud and clear from the market that the importance between the climate and nature nexus and how we bring that together so that the actions that companies are taking are more effective and efficient, and we're reducing spillover effects there. And I will stress this nexus does apply also to the S1. And with the S1 standard, we say, if you've got other issues outside climate, use the Climate Disclosure Standards Board's guidance on biodiversity and water issues. There's deep reporting guidance aligned to the standards there. Use the SASB standards and use other guidance where relevant, or standards that are out there that could help you do this. So very much there is a lot there to get started and do this already.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to question 2. So learning from climate disclosure to improve nature disclosures. I think, and we know, that nature disclosure is far behind climate disclosure. And so for this next part, I'd like to explore what lessons we've learned from climate disclosure that then we can apply to nature disclosure so that we can speed up its take-up and we don't make the same mistakes all over again. So Tanya, specifically, so disclosing Scope 3 emissions is a necessary challenge for understanding climate risks and opportunities. Many impacts on nature are also buried in firms and organizations' value chain. How can disclosures help address complex issues like deforestation, which impact both climate and nature?
Thanks for asking that very comprehensive question, Claudine. Actually, I'll do my very, very best to respond. I guess there are 3 or perhaps 4 key lessons. So the good news is we actually do have something very, very significant to build on. And I'm a great believer of accelerating and building on that platform. We do need to be focused on the future, but also the science. And ultimately, disclosures must be grounded in the best available science, particularly so that we have confidence in our actions, but also importantly in terms of how that's going to deliver for those nature and those climate goals. And that's certainly why initiatives such as the Science-Based Targets initiatives and the Science-Based Targets for Nature is really, really critical. I think secondly, and I think this really talks to Mardy's point as well, we mustn't ignore some impacts because they're harder to measure or just a little bit less visible. And that really means looking through the entire value chain. And that's really where we do start to ensure that we can crack open those Scope 3 targets and start to really carry out work on them. I mean, a very stark example, of course, is deforestation. And if I call on WWF's very recent Forest Pathways report, just in the last year alone, we lost 4 million hectares of primary tropical rainforest, an additional 6 million overall. And we know that we have absolutely no chance of meeting those climate targets. So we could be doing lots of other very good work through our supply chains. We could be doing great works on energy transition. But ultimately, if we are allowing deforestation at that kind of scale to roll through our businesses, then we really will not achieve these overall goals and outcomes. I guess thirdly, we really don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's so much learning there already, and importantly, creating a greater degree of harmonisation between standards, I think, is going to be critical. So there is very good interoperability moving forward. And I think the global approach that we've seen recently from the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosure, I think is a really good example of that. Plus also it's drawn some very, very strong lessons from TCFD as well. I think the final point I'd like to make, and it's one that often isn't surfaced, is we actually do need to be clear about how we work together globally and how we can be as inclusive as possible. These challenges are managed, absorbed, understood very differently in a range of contexts globally. From a geographical perspective. So how can we ensure that we are working alongside producers or anyone else within our supply chains to ensure that we can not just measure, but we can actually manage that transition in a way that's both appropriate, it's just, and it actually enables it to be a successful transition.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Tanya. It's a really difficult space, isn't it? Because unless we all understand what impact our finances, for example, in Aviva's case, is having, and understand the risks that we are trying to control in the supply chain or what we are financing, it's really not going to work. And what we need is actually one standard to be able to measure that across the board. And that's what makes it really, really great from a disclosure perspective and helpful. And then the climate transition plan helps you to plan forwards and what you're going to do with that risk that you've identified to be able to deal with that. So the release of the ISSB's first two standards, which you spoke about, Aviva is a really big supporter of those, because they have been serving as an effective toolkit for us for communicating our sustainability strategy to investors. So can you tell us a bit more about the consultation you recently ran on your future work priorities and how it's shaping your views what ISSB should be doing next?
Absolutely, thank you. And do you mind if I just quickly come in on the last question, because I thought that was great. I think it's what we have to remember when you're starting to prepare disclosures, and particularly disclosures for your financial report aligned with your financial reporting package for investors, is you already have so many systems and processes in place for financial information. You know, don't start in a silo on your own in a corner. Actually go and talk to where the existing processes are, internal controls, the CFO, you know, understand how this comes together, because this information needs to have the same rigor as your financial information. You know, the information you're asking for under our standards needs to be, needs to be signed off by the chairman. It will go through audit. You know, this is in the same reporting package as your financial information. So, you know, I can't urge you enough to, you know, don't try and reinvent the wheel. You will have systems and processes. You know, we do need to take the world of accounting on a journey from where they are now, but they've got systems. You know, they understand how to apply judgment. They understand how to apply estimates. They do it all the time. This might be new information to them and new ways of learning, but you've got that skills to work with them to do that. So I think it's just a really strong reminder is you don't have to always start from scratch. You know, look at what you've got in your business and build it from there. Now to your question, sorry about the consultation, but I just like to stress people, you know, don't try and do it all at once either. You know, you can take it on a phased approach and just tell people what you're doing as you're taking that phased approach. So on to our consultation. So we started with climate. The market told us we had to start with climate when we started at we put the ISSB together. I'd already done all of biodiversity and all of land and water at CDSB, right? But back to start with climate. And we recently consulted and asked the market what we should do next, because we have to do that. It's part of our remit. And we got 400 consultation responses. But we asked on 4 topics. We asked on human rights, human capital, integration in reporting, so greater connectivity between the ISSB's work and the International Accounting Standards Board's work, so making sure there was more connectivity between the work of the sustainability work and financial statements, so it could work better. And the 4th topic was on BEES, biodiversity, ecosystems and ecosystem services. And we got a range of responses back, and the board are currently deliberating right now on what comes next. We deliberate in public, the board meet in public, the papers are public. So this is something for everyone to understand. Standard setting of ISSB and IASB, my sister board standards, is all done in public. So you can read the papers in advance, you can listen to the deliberations, you can hear what the board members are saying. And so their next board meeting is next week in Frankfurt, end of next week, week after. And they'll be talking about this then. And they should have a position on how they're going to be doing this by the middle of next year at the absolute latest, and what our next steps are on that. We did ask them also how much time we should spend, what what sort of priorities should come up. And actually, we didn't get a clear steer. It was really mixed. And I expected, coming from my world mainly on the environment side, to get an overwhelming response for nature and biodiversity. But it was really a really mixed response from across the world. And we do work very hard to try and get Global South views into this as well as part of because this is a global standard for global markets and we can't have it set by the North for the South. So a bit of a long-winded thing, but we're working on it. We will know, in the next few months where nature and biodiversity will fall into the forward-going work plan. But don't use that as a reason not to start, because you can use what we've got already to do that.
Great, thank you very much. So moving on to question 3. Moving towards a holistic climate and nature disclosure. So this is all combining, all coming together in one. I think it's clear that we have a good opportunity here to integrate nature into what's being built on the climate side, but we need the right sequence to get it right. So for this final part, I'm keen to discuss the way forward from here. How do we get to a point where sustainability disclosures holistically integrate both climate and nature? And if you could try and give some practical examples maybe here of the benefits or the business cases, or talking about the role of governments would be really good, because the governments are really, really important here in setting that standard, building it into regulations for everyone to be on a level playing field and to be able to kind of get on with it and do it. So Tanya, shall I come to you first?
Sure. No, happily so. And really encouraged looking forward that we're actually talking about holistic climate and nature plans from a disclosure point of view. I think, first of all, we really need to acknowledge, and again, Mardi, some of the work you and many other colleagues have been doing, this wasn't a conversation 3 or 4 years ago. It really wasn't. We were still grappling really with carbon disclosure. So I guess the good news is to be optimistic. And I know the science is telling us we need to move quickly, but at least the acknowledgement is there, whether it's from some of the early conversations within the central banking systems, but certainly through FIs, standard setters, and beyond as well. I think importantly, there's a growing range of resources. Certainly, as we've heard this morning, we don't need to wait. That the perfect pamphlet isn't going to drop into our inbox, but there's already a whole array of resources that can help us. From a UK perspective, to give a practical example, I sit on the UK's Transition Plan Task Force, which is hosted by Treasury and also a business leader, the global CEO of Aviva. That came from the Chancellor's commitment at COP26 just 2 years ago to make the UK the greenest financial centre in the world. So that's where the commitment was. This is about the execution. So what is the transition plan to enable financial institutions and some of the largest global businesses listed on the FTSE to actually start to make it? So that framework is very much now in place, and I'm really pleased to say that there is a component of nature that has been included within it. So that's a very good starting point for businesses as they start that process, if they're listed or indeed based in the UK. And I think the feedback that we've received is an acknowledgement that the sooner that they start on that process, in a way they're finding the better, because they know they've got to do it. They know they see the signals coming down the track, that actually they might as well make a start now and actually start that whole process as well. Because I think it's not just about tidy processes. I think there's a real recognition and an acknowledgement that the longer we wait, the greater the risks certainly will continue to build as well. I think also I would like to highlight that I think the private sector has acknowledged it doesn't need to wait for government. It's already moving on this because, again, the risks are unquestionably there from an institutional perspective if you're an investor, but certainly if you're a business as well. They're starting to feel the impact in terms of the questions coming through around the nature and the risk that they are holding within their portfolios and within their operations as well. And I guess one perhaps last final practical example, I think as well as governments like the UK putting in place transition plan type frameworks, asking the private sector to step up, I think organisations like WWF are increasingly asking governments, where's your transition plan, actually? And how are you supporting that multi-sectoral pathway for net zero for carbon and net positive for nature?
Great, thank you very much. Thanks, Tanya. Mardi, any thoughts?
I mean, I'm just going to tell you to get started. I published the first framework on biodiversity and nature and environment for capital markets in 2015. You know, the writing has been on the wall. It's been in some forms of regulation since 2015. This is, you know, we've done voluntary and now we're moving to mandatory. I'm not going to talk about transition plans because that's going to double up. But I think you need to have a look at what's out there now. There is a lot of free resources out there now available. I used to run the TCFD Knowledge Hub in a last life. I actually built modules on there and detailed guidance on how to do biodiversity, water into financial reporting. And I did that 4 or 5 years ago. That is there. It's still very relevant and you can use it. We launched a Knowledge Hub yesterday at the ISSB. Again, there's how-to resources on there to get you started to help you do this. It's got over 100 very, very, very current resources on there, built with partners to support this journey. There is so much out there to help you at the moment, and that's just the bits that I know, right, that I've built. There is so much out there to help you get started. Don't put your head in the sand because the cost of getting started later will cost you a lot more. Getting started now will allow you to have those important conversations, or to think about what's most important to you, rather than just ticking boxes and thinking about how you as a preparer want to tell your story to the market. Because this isn't about compliance for compliance sake. This is about how you think about how your business is going to create value in the short, medium and long term and be resilient and be part of that transition. Not you know, what do you call not a victim of this transition, right? You want to thrive. We want businesses to thrive so we can have a, you know, really fabulous planet to live on. And if we don't start now, you know, I think just the cost and the extra work, and disclosure is not a silver bullet, right? Reporting standards, you know, we're one such tiny part of the system. We won't save the world, you know, it's not going to save the world, but it is helpful in making you think about what's needed. And it's also a great tool, disclosure, transparency and trust in markets. And what that allows, particularly, you know, we're talking about moving money this week, right, and financing the future. We can get, you know, increase those financial flows to the global south, particularly where they have adopted these standards. And we've got great early signals from countries like Zambia, Zimbabwe, Kenya, you know, Nigeria, you know, really early adopters in Africa, for example. Brazil is one of, you know, all these countries will have comparable disclosures with, you know, global north's capital markets. And if you're, you know, your staff are put in a place where they have to put like by like, and the lower, you know, the better investment decision is in the south, the money will move faster. Yeah. So it's a really important tool for that as well. So if you're looking to be able to attract capital in the global south and, you know, and finance your transition, then, you know, I'd get involved with these global standards now before, you know, the stick comes later on.
Yeah. That's really, really useful. So I'm a great believer in vision, and we've got to have some vision and some sort of North Star to aim for. So I'm going to ask you both one more question, which is, if you had a crystal ball in 5, 10, 15 years' time, you pick your timeline, what do you think this landscape would look like? Or what would you like it to look like? Tanya, do you want to go first?
That's a really rotten question. I would almost like to see a doubling of speed that we've seen. I mean, Mardi, you just mentioned that you've actually laid out some of this guidance many years ago, back in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was being forged. So I am a great believer in momentum, and I do feel this sense of speeding up. I think too, one of the final points in terms of the opportunities for often producer nations or nations that want to attract capital to really engage in this process right now and be influencing both the ability to meet those standards, but actually are those standards frankly practical to be able to report against and to transition your economy against. That for me is the game changer, because otherwise I fear that this process starts to feel like it's, you know, you could be a victim if you like, but it also means that it will not attract that flow of capital. So I think this is the opportunity to grasp the agenda. And I particularly think of this in terms of the homes of so much valuable biodiversity. You have a very, very important card to play and role to play. So I think seeing that leadership coming from colleagues around some of those most biodiverse, those really growing economies, for me would be the game changer I'd love to see in 2 to 3 years' time.
Great. Thanks, Tanya. And while Kate settles in, Mardi, do you want to have a go at that question?
My crystal ball, goodness, if I could see that. How you'd spend your time differently, right, if you could see the crystal ball. For us at the ISSB in 5 or 10 years' time, we have to hope that we've developed the global baseline, right? We've brought in all these environmental information. It won't be perfect, but we're underway, and we have global adoption. We've got adoption in 145 jurisdictions for accounting standards around the world, and we have to hope that it's 146, including the US, that have done it for climate. And so we really need to be working. And if I could look in my ball and forecast that, we're getting good traction so far. So hopefully we can see some of that in the next few years. I think we're also going to see greater consolidation, but greater pace. And that's greater pace when initiatives start to come out, these policies or directions of travel start to appear. They're going to move from noise to actually quite hard regulation quite quickly. I think particularly in this space, I think we've had a long time of voluntary. And it didn't yield the results we needed. So I think there's going to be a faster cadence from ideas to action, if you like, and something that will affect you. So I'd be trying to always be looking ahead to where you need to be at. And in 15 years' time, I'd like to think there was, and this isn't an IFRS view, this is a Marty McBrien view, but I'd like to think that there was, one global body that set the standards for all capital markets standards. And we were looking in one place for someone to be doing this. So they weren't just environmental accounting standards, maybe audit standards, maybe ethics standards, maybe everything is in one place. So it's much easier to navigate. They're much more connected. If we're developing a public sector accounting standard, it's connected to the audit. It's, it's all happening. And we are starting to see that with climate now across the others, but actually thinking about all that holistic piece in one go and seeing how this is going to play out will make this transition much, much easier and make meeting some of the nationally determined contributions much more efficient as well. So
that would be amazing because it will stop any unintended consequences happening as well. Kate, very welcome. Sorry you had to queue for so long and it's taken ages to get here. Turn it on.
Is that on? Yep. Okay, well, yes, thank you very much for having me. I'm very sorry for the very late arrival. I must say it was partly the queues and partly, I must say, I commiserate with WWF for having a particularly difficult to find pavilion, but I can see you're going strong nonetheless.
I'll dive in then, Kate, and ask you a question on TPT. So as someone who has worked closely on national guidance for transition planning, we'd love to get your thoughts on how the UK can move towards holistic climate and nature disclosures, and also on how to maintain coherence in this space, specifically between domestic and international standards.
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, people may not be familiar with what the TPT is. Maybe it's been discussed already in the last half an hour, but, briefly, this is a task force that the UK government created to say what a best practice climate transition plan looked like. And that was in the context of the UK making a commitment to be a net zero aligned financial centre and to ask listed companies and financial firms to disclose their climate transition plans from 2023. That was a commitment made at COP26. So the task force has been doing its work, has published a final framework in October, and it has some sectoral guidance out for consultation, which I'd urge you all to have a look at. From the very beginning of the work of the task force, we were asked, how will this climate transition framework incorporate issues of nature, social issues, and just transition and adaptation, given the net zero framing of the original mandate? So, we understood that this was an important issue. We created a nature working group early this year. WWF has been an absolutely leading force within that group, so thank you very much for that. They have looked at the framework and made recommendations on how nature could be integrated into the climate transition framework, and we have incorporated as many as we can of those recommendations into the final framework that was published in October. Given the importance of the topic, things moved in the surrounding UK policy environment at the same time. So in May this year, the UK government published a new green finance strategy. And in that green finance strategy, they explicitly broadened their approach to include nature, adaptation, just transition. And that is now, more, when the UK is talking about green finance, it is now very explicitly talking about nature as well as climate. I mean, it always was as a champion of the TNFD, for example, but it's much, much clearer now that that's the goal. So if you follow UK regulations, you'll know the UK has also committed to create an overarching sustainability disclosures regime. We know what some of that looks like. The Financial Conduct Authority has come up with rules for labelling of financial funds and so on, but the broader regime, we still have yet to see the shape of that. But given what I've said about the Green Finance Strategy, we'll expect nature to be fully integrated into that. So in terms of what that means for company plans going forward, I think it's more and more widely understood that nature is integral to those plans as well as climate. There probably will be a messy period when companies have climate transition plans and nature plans and adaptation plans, and eventually these will converge, I'm pretty sure, into broader sustainability plans and overall transition plans with a broad conception of transition. You can see that kind of vision already in the EU, where the EU has talked from the start in its regulations about sustainability plans. We have yet to see how that works out for companies in practice, because of course the EU has at the same time come up with lots of individual standards and individual themes. But this is very early days. All the regulators and standard setters in this field are feeling their way and very much looking to the ISSB to help us coordinate. No pressure, Mardi. It's a moving conversation, but I cannot stress how important the topic of nature has become in these international regulatory conversations, not least because it's now becoming very well understood that nature, as well as climate, poses a financial stability risk and should be taken into account by the central banks and the financial supervisors, as well as market regulators.
Thanks for that. That was great. Answered quite a few of the questions that we asked earlier as well. We did our climate transition plan last year, and we are going to do a refresh next year, which we are including climate and nature in that. I don't see why we would have two separate plans for the same issue and impact. That's, after all, two sides of the same coin, really, I think. So I'll ask just one more question, Kate, that everyone else has answered, which I think is a really important one, and then I'll throw open to the audience for questions. If you had a crystal ball and you were thinking about 5, 10, 15-year timeline, what do you think this landscape would look like? And what do you see is the best thing that could happen in that timeline?
Sure. So looking ahead, even not as long as 15 years, but looking through to 2030, perhaps, I think what we're increasingly seeing in this space broadly is a beginning of bringing the discussions together around corporate disclosure and reporting and corporate accountability, coming together with discussions around implementation of nationally determined commitments and the role of non-state actors in those. This is a convergence that we're only starting to see the beginning of, but I think we'll see more announcements at this COP. I'm sure we'll see strong urging from the UN Secretary General around bringing that together so that when we get the next round of NDCs, countries will be, I think, urged to include more nature actions, to really talk about how they're getting their non-state actors through regulation to not only just do really good reporting, but to report how they are helping the country to achieve its policy goals and its policy commitments on climate and nature. I think that's the conversation that's starting to emerge, where we bring these strands together. It is quite early days on that, but I think we'll be there sooner than 15 years. I think it's starting to move at pace.
Great, thank you very much. So I'd like to now just throw it open to the audience if there are any questions from the floor or online. Yes, if you could just introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Laurence Sommet. I'm in charge of policy and partnership for the regional office of Africa based in Yaoundé. I want to thank the panelists. Also, nice meeting you, Tanya. Yes, my question, and actually Mardi started responding to that, and it's really relating to the combination of the reporting for the climate and nature. And my question was to find out what would be the reference, the baseline, the reference document. You are reporting against what? And you started talking about the global baseline which will, and my question, is that going to integrate nature and climate, or is only climate? So yes, this document, what would that be? It's nice. The why do we need this integration and the combination? We have it. The how, I don't know if we have it, but my question is particularly the what. And does the global biodiversity framework, is that helping? Yes, we just heard it, and I think the ambition of everybody is to integrate. It's more and more in our rhetoric and so on. And Tanya mentioned that a few years ago we wouldn't be talking about this kind of thing and so on. So, is the adoption of the GBF a milestone?
Who would like to have a go at that?
I can start if you like. So when we talk about the global baseline, that's what we're trying to do at the ISSB by putting in place a set of standards right across the board, because now we have bits of standards everywhere, all over the world, and we want to make it as simple as possible, level the playing field for all large listed companies, if you like to start with, around the world, to have to report against exactly the same information. And so I call that the baseline. And so the baseline is any standard that the ISSB release. So at the moment, as part of that baseline, we have the general requirements and the climate standard, and the nexus of both those standards with nature and biodiversity would fall there. So that's, it's really easy if I've got a slide or a picture or a board to draw it on. It's slightly harder when I'm trying to do it with my hand, but it's, the idea is it does provide one solution globally for reporting to capital markets on these issues. And the piece around the global framework for biodiversity, we stay out of politics. And I know that's quite hard to understand, but we don't get involved in politics. And so we do stay out of it. Now, if I took my hat off, it does say that, you know, disclosure will be required. I think the challenge for us as an organization, candidly speaking, is can we get a standard out before that's going to be required, or are we going to see further fragmentation? And, you know, there's a pace challenge there that is going to need to play out through our rigorous standard setting processes that take, you know, some time. And the 2030 target for mandatory reporting and governments having to act in the interim, uncertain what we're going to do. So, you know, candidly speaking, I think there's a question there whether we can do it in time. I think we probably can, but, you know, it is dependent on what the market tell us on the consultation responses, what the monitoring board that oversee our work say. You know, we have to be market-led, and if the market aren't telling us that biodiversity and nature are the biggest priority for us to be working on, it's very difficult for us to do it. But when you're seeing an environment like COP, you can see why we think it's, you know, I think it's one of the most important topics. But if you're out in the real world, and we've got, you know, we have a lot of accountants that respond to our consultations. They don't tend to think nature's important. So, you know, you get a very different, and we have to be market-led. That is the absolute fundamental part of our constitution. So I think, you know, we have to hope that common sense prevails and we can move fast.
Anyone else like to?
I'd love to, unless Kate wants to go in first. I guess a couple of things, really, in terms of Marty's right. Again, there's, as you highlighted earlier, there's a whole range of baseline standards, but there's rightly a more active consultation process now underway in terms of actually what's that going to mean. Specifically addressing the global biodiversity framework question, and I was very struck in Montreal how one of the very big wins, as well as the headline in the text in terms of halting and reversing biodiversity loss, but where the really big stride was made was in terms of 30% of land, fresh water and sea to be conserved. But we know well that our science actually points to the fact, forget just the 30%, what about the 70% of pressure that's coming from the rest of the planet? We have no hope of maintaining that 30%, and the reality is we have no hope of achieving the global biodiversity framework goals unless we can manage some of the impacts on production and consumption more generally. one of the really strong elements coming through was Target 15 in the GBF framework, which commits, and I was just getting it up on my iPad, parties to ensure large companies and financial institutions regularly monitor, assess, and transparently disclose their risks, dependencies, and impacts on biodiversity. So I think we've got a job as civil society in terms of both informing and certainly holding to account and pressurizing that process. So it's not just a nice bit of text that really doesn't see the light of day, but how do we connect it much more directly into these processes underway, and indeed remind duty bearers of the role that they have in ensuring that they are meeting those targets. So I actually think at the moment this is a job that sits more broadly than the standard setters, if you like. I think we have to make the conditions, create the conditions, so that those standards will be both enhanced and adopted as well.
And I guess that's where the plans come in, because we need the right plans in place to be able to do that.
Yes.
But both sort of from a government's perspective, but also firms and organisations.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much to add to the excellent responses that Mardi and Tanya gave, but I would like to say, from the firm perspective, for regulators, it's the core requirements that we need from firms should be kind of sector neutral and across the board in terms of ensuring corporate accountability and integrity. But it is appropriate also to look at what are the key sectors where this is particularly important, and that might vary by jurisdiction as well, depending on the economic structure of particular countries. But, obviously the food and agriculture sector is one that has a particularly outsized impact on nature, and is one where we should be really looking to help create norms as fast as possible in terms of what's expected from them and what we want to see and how fast they can do it.
Thank you. Are there any other questions on the...
Thanks. I'm David McCauley. I'm advisor to a number of the global environment, the multilateral climate funds. And my question has to do with integration. You've all talked about it in one form or another, saying you might have 3 standards for mitigation, adaptation, and nature, or your work plan includes focusing on integration, especially at the institutional level. And I'm just wondering how nature, since this is focused on nature, how might the attention to nature and the links between climate and nature that run, you need a systems perspective to understand all those links, but clearly the benefits that we see on mitigation in terms of forests or on adaptation based on the functions of healthy ecosystems, how that might be used within the context of the efforts that are ongoing on integration. Thanks. And why isn't, I understand TCFD was very focused on mitigation. Do we need more attention on physical risks and on adaptation within this? Because that would be part of that integrative effort. Thanks.
Absolutely, completely agree. So would you like to have a go, Kate, you first?
Sure, I guess I'll make a start on this. It's quite a big question. I mean, obviously, yes, that systems perspective is extremely important, and until we have that, I do appreciate the ISSB is working as hard as it can to get more standards out. Until we have that, it's very difficult to manage the trade-offs. So, what are the trade-offs, particularly in sort of land use, for example, across mitigation, adaptation, and energy as well. So not denying the importance of that. I think it's possibly a little unfair to say that the TCFD only focuses on mitigation. The TCFD came out of a background of managing and addressing risks and opportunities, and address both transition risk and physical risks from climate. I think the challenge has been that the market wasn't really ready to take up the physical risk side of that in a big way. The understanding of those risks in the world, I'd say, actually, but certainly in the market, is much, much lower. And that makes it very difficult for firms to kind of grapple with and deal with. And it may be that part of the challenge there is that actually we need an ecosystem developing to help with management of physical risks that's a little bit different, where we understand that we are just dealing with a high level of uncertainty and we won't know everything and have perfect data sets for everything and still have to take management decisions on the basis of things that could happen, including tail risks, cascading risks, etc. But I'm sorry, that's a slight diversion. But of course, those issues apply absolutely to nature as well, and we're starting to see that play out when we get extreme weather and this affects harvests. This exactly creates those cascading risks and systemic risks, and we're starting to see that in terms of sort of food security issues, so it's certainly not something that's restricted to climate.
Mardi, any thoughts on that?
And just to say that if you go in and pick up the standards from a compliance perspective, you're probably not picking them up for the right reason. We should be picking up and looking at this from an opportunity perspective, and an opportunity for finance and transition. And you can always do things for compliance, but if you pick them up and you are only picking them up for compliance, I kind of feel like you're picking them up for the wrong reasons. These are things to help you think about that important transition and the opportunities you can get from that, thinking ahead and that resilience and addressing them up front. And Kate mentioned estimations, and I did say earlier that you do have people in your businesses that are comfortable making estimates. That is their job. Find those around you that are comfortable with the things that you're not as comfortable with, and learn from each other. I think this is a really great opportunity. I mean, it's all about system change and systems thinking. So you need every skill and every piece, everyone at the table, and everyone's brain and skill sets there. And so, really learning from each other and building that in. I think that is a massive opportunity from all of this work in itself.
Tanya?
I think Kate and Mardi have smashed it.
Yeah, brilliant. We are sort of running out of time. So I'm actually going to hand over to Tanya to talk about just brief closing remarks and to end us with. Thanks. Hand over to you.
Not at all, thank you. And very, very brief closing remarks just to reassure colleagues, as it were. I mean, can I just say a huge thank you for joining us today on this really critical and growing issue. And I think in a second, I'll also thank our panelists as well. I think first and foremost, we've heard really clearly that so many resources already exist. I'm ashamed, Mardi, I didn't realise that actually some of this was laid down as early as 2015, so I have to put my hands up. Equally, I know this has been a process, and we've certainly seen some growth in the depth and actually the momentum as well. But unquestionably, there are so many resources at play. Yes, we know there are a range of standards, but equally ISSB is on its way too, and I think that's to be welcomed and endorsed. I think we've also heard quite a strong theme as well that whilst we might at times describe this as the global north has been working on this, actually we need to hear, and we would hope, I think, to invite much more engagement, challenge from producer countries, from emerging economies, very much from the global south. This has to be something that works for the entirety of our very precious resources on our planet. So I think we should see that as an opportunity to ensure that we actually get a better set of standards and certainly a better set of outcomes as well. And I guess finally, I think we've heard a lot about momentum. This is a real opportunity to capitalise on. It's not just a compliance issue, and I think that for me is certainly a message I will look to take forward very much as well. But I wonder if we could finish really by thanking our excellent panellists and chair. If we could thank Kate Levick from E3G and the Transition Plan Task Force, Mardi McBrien from IFRS as well, and certainly en route from Abu Dhabi as well. Big appreciate that. And Claudine Blamey as well as the Chief Sustainability Officer of Viva. But I hope you'll join me in a small round of applause. Thank you.